electoral votes. So Republicans and Democrats rushed to those three states to watch and try and influence the counting of the votes. They spoke to the state legislatures. They spoke to whomever they could. They were, doing whatever they had to do. We needed our votes. The returning boards determined which votes to count and could throw out votes if they deemed them fraudulent. The returning boards in all three states argued that fraud, intimidation, and violence in certain districts invalidated votes, so they're throwing votes out. And they threw out enough Democratic votes for Hayes to win the presidency. Sounds criminal. Sounds illegal. Sounds like election interference. Meanwhile, in Oregon, a strange development added that state to the uncertain mix. Hayes won the state, but one of the Republican electors, John W. Watts, was also postmaster. And the U.S. Constitution forbids federal office holders from being electors. Watts planned to resign from his position in order to be a Republican elector, but the governor of Oregon, who was a Democrat, disqualified Watts and instead certified a Tilden elector. Oh, as we say in Yiddish, such mishigas going on. Well, electors cast their ballots in state capitals on December 6, 1876. Generally, the process went smoothly, but in four capitals, Salem, Oregon, Columbia, South Carolina, Tallahassee, Florida, and New Orleans, Louisiana, two sets of conflicting electors met and voted so that the U.S. Congress received two sets of conflicting electoral votes. Oh, fake electors. Why did they do that? You know why they did it? Footnote. Because they were going to challenge the election on the floor of the House, where both chambers meet, the Senate and the House, to count the Electoral College votes. If you don't send a separate set of electors in, then the other side automatically wins. There's nothing to count. They're not fake electors. They're a second set of electors sent by the other party. Boy, that must be a crime. At this point, Tilden had 184 electoral votes, while Hayes had 165, with 20 votes still disputed. So Tilden was in the lead, substantially so. Well, the Constitution stipulates that the electoral votes be directed to the President of the Senate, who was a Republican, Thomas W. Ferry, although Republicans argued that he had the right to decide which votes to count. Wow, almost sounds like advice given by John Eastman to the former vice president. Democrats disagreed and argued that the Democratic majority in the Congress should decide. Well, a compromise was reached, and on January 29, 1877, the Electoral Commission Act established a commission of 5 senators, 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 5 representatives, 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 5 Supreme Court justices, believe it or not, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 1 independent, to decide which votes to count and resolve the dispute. But the independent Supreme Court justice refused to serve on the commission and was replaced by a Republican justice. So you had 5 Supreme Court justices, 3 of whom were Republican appointees. Although Hayes did not initially support the commission, he changed his mind because it would enhance the legitimacy of the eventual winner. Plus, the Republicans controlled the vote. The commission voted 8-7 to award the electoral votes from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, and 1 from Oregon to Hayes. Remember, he was 20 behind. Now, Democrat members of Congress threatened to prevent the count of the electoral votes and delay the resolution of the election with frequent adjournments and filibustering. With the threat of delay, Democrats hoped to win some concessions from Republicans. Blackmail? Obstruction? 2 issues interested Democrats: restoring their control of governments and thus white supremacy in the South. Oh, you clever Democrats, always for slavery and segregation. And removing the last of the federal troops and the federal subsidy for railroads. However, it's doubtful that Hayes, his supporters, and Democrats reached any sort of deal beyond what Hayes promised to do in his letter of acceptance. Samuel J. Randall, the Democratic Speaker of the House, realizing that creating chaos would backfire on the Democrats, finally ruled that filibusters out of order and forced the completion of the count in the early hours of March 2, 1877. With 185 votes to Tilden's 184, Hayes was declared the winner 2 days before he was inaugurated. While Hayes strongly supported African Americans' right to vote and protection of civil rights, he had little influence in the South. By the time he took office, the only federal troops still in the South protecting Republican governments were limited to small areas surrounding state houses in the capitals of New Orleans and Columbia. Hayes insisted that Democrats in South Carolina and Louisiana pledged to uphold civil and voting rights of black and white Republicans. Once the Democrats agreed, Hayes pulled the remaining federal troops out of the South, and white Southerners quickly turned their backs on their pledges, systematically disenfranchising black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. Democrats in the South created a segregated society and used terror and violence to oppress African Americans. And Hayes had little power to control the Democratic governments in the South. Anyway, 1876. Wow, what a year. Let me talk to you about the allegations against Trump and others brought by an unconstitutionally appointed rogue special counsel. That would be Jack Smith. His appointment violates the Constitution. He has enormous prosecutorial powers, but he never had to present himself to the Senate Judiciary Committee or to the Senate for a vote. Well, what's the issue? Basically this: attempting to influence state officials to subvert the legitimate election results. Ladies and gentlemen, candidates are free to try and influence state legislatures, governors, or whomever is involved in the count in the voting system to see if there's any way that they may win or may have won, or if there's something the other side did. It's not a crime. It's not subverting the legitimate election results, quote unquote. The election is not over until the House and the Senate, the members of Congress meeting jointly, say it's over. That's the whole point. Organizing fraudulent slates of electors. Fraudulent slates of electors, you mean like in 1876? It's a second slate of electors to challenge the election on the floor of the House where the Senate and House members are meeting. They decide who the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States are going to be under our system. Using the Department of Justice to conduct sham election criminal investigations. Sham says who? We have criminal investigations being done by the Department of Justice on election fraud all the time out of the radical left-wing Civil Rights Division that is constantly accusing states and counties of criminal violations of the election codes. There's nothing new with that. Knowingly and fraudulently attempting to influence the vice president's role in certifying electoral votes. When you have a lawyer like John Eastman or others trying to convince the president of the Senate, that is, the vice president of the United States, Pence, no, you have the power to do X versus Y, whether Pence might be uncomfortable, whether people may not like it, that's not a crime. It's never been a crime. Utilizing the events of January 6, 2021 to, quote, levy false claims of election fraud and convince members of Congress to delay the certification? Free speech? Trying to influence the outcome of an election? Not subvert an election. You're challenging the election. It's been done since the beginning of elections in the United States of America. Now, what does any of this have to do with the immunity hearing that took place in front of the Supreme Court? Why is that case in the court? Why is there, for the first time in American history, a dispute over whether a president's immunity carries over to his post-presidential life when he conducted himself a certain way as president? Why is this front and center? Why has this never been an issue before? Well, because of Trump, that's ridiculous. Obama could be charged. Biden will be charged. This is ridiculous. Do you know why it's in front of the Supreme Court? Because the Biden administration and their rogue unconstitutional prosecutor, with their deaf, dumb, and blind attorney general, they have criminalized politics. They have criminalized the electoral process. Everything they claim that Trump did is not a crime. Now, how else do we know that? Not only through our own history, that they've criminalized elections and a political process. What is Trump charged with? Insurrection? No. Sedition? No. He's charged with the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act and its more recent iterations. I just told you about an election that took place in 1876, after the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act was passed. Nobody even thought about bringing a case against Tilden, against Hayes, against state legislatures, against anybody. The Enron Obstruction Act. What's that all about? They used that. Did the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington have the judges in Washington, D.C. against the January 6ers? The problem is it doesn't fit. They had to rewrite the statute. The circuit court, the three-judge panel with Biden appointees, they rewrote it to apply to those protesters. The Supreme Court's having to hear that case as well and decide on it. And then a law that's used against potentially corrupt federal contractors, the Klan Act, the Enron Act, a federal contractors law. That's what they're bringing against Trump. And the Supreme Court is sitting there like a debating society. It didn't look like they were debating law. They were debating philosophy. Well, what's private? What's official? What if SEAL Team 6 is sent to overthrow, or a president sends out the military? Or what if UFOs come down and a president is actually an alien? And what? It was embarrassing. It was humiliating. The man arguing the case is working for an unconstitutional prosecutor who's brought this country to the brink, whether it's immunity or other aspects of our constitutional system. The justices should be familiar with Jack Smith. He went there before, when it was the governor of Virginia, a Republican. He brought a preposterous case. He rewrote the statute. And so the governor was convicted, only to have the 8 justices who ruled on the case rule unanimously, overturn it, and say that the statute didn't say what Mr. Smith said it said. And so now Mr. Smith goes back to the Supreme Court with all this stuff because he's criminalized an electoral process, a political process that can be ugly, that involves talking to one another, that involves separate electors, and he's criminalized every piece of it, not under the insurrection or sedition statutes, but he dusts off these ridiculous statutes and throws them at Donald Trump. And now the court's caught up in all the static. The court's caught up in Mr. Smith's world. The court's caught up in something that is really quite dangerous. Now they're going to decide whether to take on private conduct